and welcome to Season 3 of the Elixir Poetry Podcast. A podcast where we ask ordinary people from around the world to read a poem that means something to them, and we ask them why and how it speaks to their heart. Hello and welcome again to another episode of the Elixir Poetry Podcast. Today we're going to be talking to Tad, who lives in London. Hello, Tad. Welcome to the podcast. We're very privileged to have you on the programme. Tad lives in London, is British in many, many ways, but I hear, Tad, that you have recently become a citizen of the proud nation of Spain. Is that correct?
Hi, Helen. Yes, it is true. Found out yesterday that they have approved my citizenship application. So I'm in the process of applying for my passport, all thanks to my grandmother, born in the 1930s on the border between Gibraltar and Spain. And so my whole family is now Spanish.
That's wonderful. However, I realise that you have chosen as your favourite poem a very, very British poem. What's the poem you're going to read to us today?
Despite being Spanish, I'm still very much British at heart. The poem I've chosen today is The Darkling Thrush by Thomas Hardy, one of Britain's great poets. Shall I read it to you?
I'd love you to read it to me.
Okay. The Darkling Thrush. I leant upon a coppice gate when frost was spectre grey, and winter's dregs made desolate the weakening eye of day. The tangled bindstems scored the sky like strings of broken lyres, and all mankind that haunted nigh had sought their household fires. The land-sharp features seemed to be the century's corpse outleant, his crypt the cloudy canopy, the wind his death lament. The ancient pulse of germ and birth was shrunken hard and dry, and every spirit upon earth seemed fervorless as I. At once a voice arose among the bleak twigs overhead, in a full-hearted evensong of joy illimited. An aged thrush, frail, gaunt, and small, in blast beruffled plume, had chosen thus to fling his soul upon the growing gloom. So little cause for carolings of such ecstatic sound was written on terrestrial things afar or nigh around, that I could think there trembled through his happy good-night air some blessed hope whereof he knew, and I was unaware.
Yeah, that's just an amazing poem. You know, I don't know whether you had this at school because you're a very young man, but my generation, so your father and me and my husband, we all studied this poem in our poetry anthology called Rhyme and Reason, or what was then called the O level in English. So I think there've been many, many people in Britain who really remember this poem. So would you like to tell us why you love it?
It's funny you say that. So I actually read this poem at school
Oh,
when
right.
I was 17, so 15 years ago now. And I must have read dozens of poems at school and studied them. And this is the only one that has stood out to me for the last 15 years. And I remember reading it for the first time as a 17 or 18-year-old and being really struck by it. And I still return to it every so often and reread it and think about it. And it's one of the only poems that I can recite almost by heart. I mean, I occasionally get the word wrong, but I loved it at school and I love it now. So yeah, nice that we both have that same connection to the poem.
Yeah. Did you know that it originally was called By the Century's Deathbed?
I did, yes, because it was published, I think, in late December 1900, although there's thoughts of maybe he may have written it in 1899. And the premise of it, I suppose, and we can get into this, and it means much more to me than just the year changing. But I suppose the premise of it is Hardy was writing it at the very end of the 19th century. The 19th century was dying, as he talks all about its corpse outlent and the crypt. The cloud, his crypt, the cloudy canopy, and all that. So yeah, I'm not surprised by that title, but it means much more to me than just sort of the cycle and changing of the year.
But what does it mean to you, Tad?
A couple of things. So first of all, and first and perhaps least, is I just love the imagery of it. So the imagery of a man, I assume it's a man, Don't know why, but I do, standing on his own at the edge of a forest in the winter, staring into the dark forest. The trees have lost all their leaves. The tangled vine stems score the sky. Everything's cold and dark. There's a wind blowing. I grew up. I say I grew up in the country. For a lot of my youth, I lived in the country, and I used to walk my dog of a winter evening in the fields around near where I lived. And this was in Essex, which is very different to Dorset, where Hardy grew up. But there was a small forest where I used to walk my dog, and there was a gate at the entrance of this forest. And so I remember reading this poem thinking, I know exactly what he's talking about. I've,
Yeah.
I've done that. I've stood at the entrance of this forest at 4 o'clock in a December evening when the sun is just about to set, and I've looked out over the fields around, and it's been dark and cold, and there's been a wind blowing. And I thought, I've never known anyone describe it like this before. So it's a resonance of childhood, sort of fundamentally for me. But I suppose more importantly, I'm quite a pessimistic person naturally, and I think Hardy was quite a pessimist too. And what I love about this poem is that it lays out this scene of abject pessimism. The century is dead, everything's cold and dark. Mankind has that everyone has sought their household fires. The ancient pulse of German birth was shrunken hard and dry. Everything's dead and cold or dying. But there is optimism
Yeah.
in the very depths of winter. An aged thrush, frail, gaunt, and small, in blast beruffled plume, had chosen thus to fling his soul upon the growing gloom. So it doesn't matter how cold and miserable things are and how you perceive them to be, there is always some hope, small, perhaps invisible. I mean, it's the darkling thrush. It's obscured, it's dark, we hardly see it, but you can still hear it if you listen for it. And I love that sense of optimism, even in the darkest of times. And also, sort of jump in if I'm rambling, but also the religious undertones of the poem, which are definitely there. And Hardy, he grew up in an Anglican household. His dad and I think his uncle were very much involved in his local church. And later in life, I think he became what we would now call an agnostic. He was really unsure about religion, and I think
Mm.
writings of Darwin made him very unsure.
And Nietzsche's claim that God was dead, and
I
then
think so.
and as it's interesting because he, as you say, I think he was always quite a pessimist, and you just have to read his novel. But there are always these sparks of life and love in them as well.
Yeah, and I think in this poem he's definitely leaning more towards, on the agnostic scale, he's definitely leaning more towards
Mm,
faith
mm,
slightly. I mean, it's, you know, most obviously some blessed hope
mm,
whereof he knew and I was unaware. Hope is capitalized.
yeah,
It's emphasizing perhaps religion. I mean, the thrush's song is a full-hearted evensong. Evensong being a beautiful Anglican service that Hardy would have been well familiar with. So little cause for carolings. Think of Christmas carols, Easter carols.
yeah.
So Hardy is saying here, I think that I'm not entirely sure about religion, but maybe there is something.
Yeah, and you can make these claims, you can make these negative claims, these protestations of the absence of God, but actually we're so structured to respond to the idea that there is something other than us and that it's a force for good and that there's this architecture that remains, our emotional reactions remain there, um, even as we protest a loss of faith, we're
Yes.
patterned to believe and to hope. It's wonderful. I think this is beautiful. I also think that, whenever I thought about that thrush, frail, gaunt, and small, I thought in some way he was projecting himself into the thrush, even though he was saying he was unaware of the thrush's inner life, inner spark of hope, because he must have been 60 when he wrote this.
Yeah. Apparently, he was sort of described as almost bird-looking when he
Really?
was young. I remember reading this apparently, and
Oh,
he was.
I know
People
that.
said he looked a bit like an old bird in sort of that sort of Victorian old man bearded style. So maybe he is.
Yeah.
He's putting himself in here as well. Yeah,
It's
but
incredible, isn't it, how poems speak to us individually. I love that, how people take their own things, like your description of going for walks when you were young into like a coppice in the cold and the freezing, and how you can immediately identify with it. I always felt that
Yeah,
other poem. There's another poem called Adolstrop, which is just looking out over the fields, and it's a vision of a sudden understanding that you're part of something so much greater than yourself. And it seems like it's nothing. It seems like just a pastoral poem about birdsong and fields. But you come away with this incredible feeling of plenitude and if you like, a release from individual responsibility. Just actually, no, I'm part of something. It's not that I have to act on something the whole time. I'm part of something. And that poem had a similar effect on me as the one you're describing with the Darkling Thrush. It's such an amazing image.
I think that's poetry at its best, right? It sort of resonates with your personal experience and then makes you think about something even greater, I
Yeah.
think. And that sounds like what that poem does to you. And that's, I think, what this poem does to me too.
Yeah, that's lovely. So now that we've heard how you feel about this poem, could you read it again for our readers so they can listen to it with their picture of you walking your dog in their minds?
Walking my dog in the dark and cold, thinking about God and whether he exists or not. The Darkling Thrush by Thomas Hardy. I leant upon a coppice gate when frost was spectre grey, and winter's dregs made desolate the weakening eye of day. The tangled vine stems scored the sky like strings of broken lyres, and all mankind that haunted nigh had sought their household fires. The land's sharp features seemed to be the century's corpse outlent, his crypt the cloudy canopy, the wind his death lament. The ancient pulse of germ and birth was shrunken hard and dry, and every spirit upon earth seemed fervorless as I. At once a voice arose among the bleak twigs overhead, in a full-hearted evensong of joy illimited. An aged thrush, frail, gaunt, and small, in blast beruffled plume, had chosen thus to fling his soul upon the growing bloom. So little cause for carolings of such ecstatic sound was written on terrestrial things afar or nigh around, that I could think there trembled through his happy good-night air some blessed hope whereof he knew and I was unaware.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. And there's something so, I don't know, I think of this as something very British, this idea that you take a bird like a thrush, it's not an eagle, it's not an albatross, it's not a peacock.
Mm-hmm.
It's an ordinary garden bird. I mean, it's a very pretty bird, but it's not magnificent in the way that, some people, might adore that type of that type of image. And it's so incredibly humble and yet capable of inspiring a sense of glory, of miracle, of miraculousness. It's lovely, really beautiful.
It is lovely. When I was sort of prepping for this podcast, and I was rereading some of the notes I made as a child, I reread something, and it made me think. Astonishingly, I was astonished. So the line "at once a voice arose among," apparently, and I have checked on YouTube, and I have sort of double checked this, that the each I am in that. So at once a voice arose among. It echoes the thrush's sort of do 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 do
Oh, what?
song accurately.
Yeah.
And I was gobsmacked when I read that and I listened to it, and you do almost get it, the sort of the short long short long short long
Yeah.
is amazing. And of course, in our sort of 21st century urban society, none of us really knows what a thrush sounds like. There's far less nature than there was when Hardy was writing this, but his listeners would have heard a thrush in the winter. They would have been in the countryside and they would have picked up on things like that perhaps we miss now.
Yeah. No, that's very, very true.
Yeah.
Kat, that was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on our podcast. And for our listeners, we will be putting the poem onto the website, which you can find in a link to the podcast. Thank you very much, Tad.
Thank you so much for having me, Helen. This has been wonderful.
If you're a regular listener and are enjoying the podcast, it would mean the world to me if you could hit the follow button on your podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review and a 5-star rating. Remember, you can find the poems that feature in each episode on my website, helenwing.com. If you'd like to support the production costs of our Elixir Poetry podcast, please feel free to buy me a coffee. Thanks for listening.